Lionel Skinner, The Needle and a Spoon. And the reason why I started with that, and I would normally start this lecture playing that video while students were coming into the lecture room, is because of the drug reference in it. The Needle and the Spoon, obviously a reference to taking heroin, and the lead singer of that band, Ronnie Van Zant, was a well-known drug addict during the highest point of their career. But the reason for showing it is that I knew the lyric of that song long before I had any idea about what heroin was or what the needle and the spoon referred to. And of course, all the way through music and modern cultures, we have references to drugs and drugs of abuse. And that's why in this lecture, I'm not going to go really deep into the pharmacology or the neuroscience of each of these drugs, because the topic is much wider than that. Drugs of abuse, addiction, intolerance takes in politics, sociology, psychology, and of course pharmacology and neuroscience as well, and some physiology. So it's a hugely complex, interwoven topic. I'm going to stick to sort of classic drugs, like not the more modern drugs that are hitting the streets just now, synthetic compounds where the pharmacology is kind of unknown in many respects. We'll stick to the sort of classics: cannabis, amphetamine, the heroin, morphine, and LSD. Then that kind of covers more or less the drugs of abuse. And the more modern drugs are probably different modern twists on those old classics. So we'll look at these drugs, we will look at their pharmacology, and I will point you to some other reading. But I would like you to consider, though, the other aspects that are involved, as I said, the elements of psychology and sociology that are interwoven into this really fascinating and complex topic. So in this presentation, we're looking at drugs of abuse, the classic drugs, the classic families of drugs, and I'm not going to be touching on the more modern synthetic compounds. The pharmacology of them is not particularly clear, so I think it's easier to stick to kind of the big drugs of abuse, LSD, heroin, cannabis, amphetamines. It's surprising perhaps that of the 30 million or so compounds that are believed to exist in nature, there's only about 100 or so that are actually addictive. Now, what makes a drug addictive and how we become tolerant to a drug is something that we'll cover in the second lecture in this series. In this lecture, though, we're just going to look at what's the key elements, or what are the common mechanisms that exist amongst the drugs of abuse. What's the same and what's different? The psychedelic spider that you're looking at there has a role to play in all this, and we'll come back to that. So why do we take drugs? What's the purpose of taking drugs? Well, there's no doubt that it's enjoyable. But what are the only two things that humans really enjoy? What do we really, really enjoy? And if you think about it, regardless of the activity that you're involved in, what it comes down to is dopamine and serotonin, or 5-hydroxytryptamine, 5-HT. Dopamine and 5-HT. That's the things that humans really, really like. And we will engage in activities that will elevate our brain concentrations of dopamine and serotonin, 5-HT. Whether it's eating food, listening to music, having sex, taking drugs. Well, anything that will increase the concentrations of those two compounds in your brain is going to give you a good feeling. And it's because it's tied into a reward pathway that you can see on this slide here. So our reward pathway starts here in the ventral tegmental area. And you'll see that there are these black lines here represent dopaminergic fibers or dopaminergic pathways that go out to the nucleus accumbens to the amygdala, which is concerned with emotion, and out here to the frontal cortex and to the prefrontal cortex. Now, if the reward pathway is linked to the areas of the brain which are involved in planning and judgment, then it makes sense. And it makes sense why you would plan to do something that gives you enjoyment, that rewards you. And in particular, if we think about eating and having sex, then that keeps us alive. It keeps the species going. And since both of those activities are pleasurable, then we try to continue to do them. So that's why we have a reward pathway. And really what we do with the drugs of abuse is that we abuse that pathway. It's debatable whether or not we abuse the drug, but certainly what we're doing is we're abusing the pathway. And by say abusing a drug, that gets us into a conversation about misuse of drugs rather than abuse of drugs. We can come back to that probably in the second lecture. So if it's all about dopamine, isn't it surprising then that dopamine blockers don't particularly work? But that mice in which particular dopamine receptors are knocked out, they don't seem to seek drugs. So pharmacologically, it's difficult to cure addiction and dependence, but genetically and physiologically, if we knock out receptors, we can change behavioural patterns. And we're just going to really scratch the surface of these topics as we go through this lecture. So we really do need to think about what drugs are we talking about and how are they classified. I've taken this table from the Home Office website. I've checked the current entry and it's exactly as is written here, although this table was taken from last year. The drugs are categorised into A, B and C. So a class A drug like crack, cocaine, ecstasy, LSD and so on. Okay, these are like really serious stuff. Up to 7 years imprisonment and up to life imprisonment for supply and production of the drugs. Class B, we've got the barbiturates, amphetamines, cannabis, so on. And Class B. In Class C, anabolic steroids, you see GHB and CAT. What is it that gives the drugs a particular classification? You might be wondering, why is cannabis a Class B drug? Why is cocaine a Class A drug? And what's missing from these classifications? Well, the classifications are based on drugs that do harm. So the idea here is that the more harmful a drug is, then the higher its classification. The more serious it is for you to be caught in possession or caught in engagement in the supply of the drug. Isn't it interesting though that alcohol and nicotine are missing from a table of drugs in which the table is classified by drugs which do harm? Now, it's not to say necessarily that nicotine does a lot of harm, but there's no question it's quite an addictive drug. I think you could probably argue fairly that alcohol does harm. Maybe not in low concentrations and moderate use, but certainly at high concentrations. So that's something just to think about. We're not going to get into a debate on that. Maybe had we been doing this session live or in a lecture theatre, we might have spent a little bit more time talking about issues around that. Now, this is where we come back to the spiders. Kind of light-hearted, but interesting nonetheless, particularly since this research was done by NASA, or rather that it was published in one of a NASA journal in the NASA technical briefs. This research group were using spiders as a measure of determining drug toxicity, and as you see here, the marijuana, benzodrine and caffeine really have quite significant effects on spiders' ability to weave webs. Now, there's nothing of particular importance in this other than to link to a video that I will point you to when we come back to this. But it does show that in a relatively simple organism or animal, if we can call it that, as a spider, the drugs that we would typically abuse have an effect on the spiders as well. And you can see here, particularly caffeine, and that's what I would draw your attention to. Do we not think about caffeine as a drug? You know, we don't perhaps think about nicotine and alcohol as drugs in the sense that drugs that we abuse. Could we argue that caffeine is a drug that we abuse quite consistently, or certainly those of us that like coffee and those of us that like particularly strong coffee? Here's a picture of Alan Baxter. He is a Scottish skier. He won a bronze medal at Olympic Games. Salt Lake City. I can't even remember the date. I think it was quite a long while ago. But he had the bronze medal taken off him because he failed the drugs test. But the drug that he took was levomethamphetamine, and that was a banned substance. Unfortunately, because the L enantiomer of methamphetamine is pretty ineffective. And when you get it in, as you can see here, in Vicks inhaler, this is not an amphetamine in the way that we think of methamphetamine. Quite different. I do believe that he eventually did get his bronze medal back. But the reason I put this in here is that it's important to note that drugs which have L and D forms, stereoisomer drugs, can be really quite different. You know, the difference between L methamphetamine and D methamphetamine could not be any more stark. Now, the methamphetamine, the D form of methamphetamine, is the one that would typically be abused. And it's not that hard to make it. You know, well, you may have seen Breaking Bad, a Netflix series. It certainly needs a degree of chemistry knowledge, but you'll have seen from that series, and even in some YouTube videos, that it is possible to make methamphetamine at home. You need to be careful. One of the starting products is Sudafed, or it can be found in Sudafed, pseudoephedrine. And you can go from pseudoephedrine to methamphetamine through a chemical process, which doesn't need to be done in a factory, but certainly needs to be done very, very carefully. Then you end up with an amphetamine, a form of amphetamine, which is really rather potent. So let's look at amphetamine, speed, or whiz, as it's more commonly known. So amphetamine is what we would refer to as an indirect sympathomimetic. That is, it's a drug which can mimic the actions of the sympathetic nervous system. It's a drug which enters in through the uptake 1 mechanism, so that mechanism which is normally there to reuptake noradrenaline or other catecholamines. The amphetamine goes in through the uptake 1 mechanism and displaces noradrenaline and dopamine, and so they come out of their vesicles and they become cytosolic, and the cytosol of the nerve varicosity, and they can then, those noradrenaline and dopamine can then leak out of the uptake 1 mechanism and into the nerve muscle junction, so you get increased concentrations of the neurotransmitter. So that's why it's like a sympathomimetic, it mimics the sympathetic system. Methamphetamine, or crystal meth, is more lipid soluble. Now, if it's more lipid soluble, as you can imagine, it's going to cross the blood-brain barrier quicker. It's more stable and it's more potent. So that's why a drug user may prefer methamphetamine to amphetamine. And then we've got MDMA, or methylene dioxymethamphetamine. Now, it's the same as the crystal meth, but it has an additional 5-HT effect, what acts as an agonist and reduces 5-HT transporters. So sometimes used along with the LSD, which is called candy flipping, or mushrooms, sorry, which is called hippie flipping. But crucially here, it can increase your body temperature. Now, I remember a lecture given by a well-known pharmacologist, so well-known I actually can't remember his name at the moment. It'll come back to me. He was given a lecture actually in the West Medical Building, and he told us about experiments that had been done in the drug company that he was working with. And this was at the time when ecstasy was being used a lot at raves. I guess it must have been, I don't know, early 90s, something like that. Yeah, I think so, the 90s. So MDMA, which is also ecstasy, can cause an increase in brain temperature. And in some experiments they did with rat brains, they measured an increase of 2.6 degrees, as I remember. So a fairly large dose of ecstasy, it must be stated. But that's huge, you know, to increase your brain temperature to by 2.6 degrees is like almost cooking your brain. So it'd be crazy to take that amount of ecstasy, but you can see that it's not going to end well. And methamphetamine also has cardiovascular effects, but it also has effects on the immune system. And there was one report where they gave, I think it was 1 gram per kilogram of methamphetamine to rhesus monkeys, and it raised the dopamine levels in these animals by 1,350%. And there was a 500% increase in dopamine levels in the brain 2 hours after administering the drug. So I mean, these are huge effects. So you really can't be stressed enough the serious physiological effects that these drugs have. Now, you'll be familiar possibly with amphetamine also as a slimming drug, presumably because it must increase metabolism and certainly increase your activity. You get locomotor stimulation, some euphoria and excitement. I've listed there anorexia because that's of course tied in with weight loss. So you need to be careful with using these particular drugs. One particular study that I did like when I was reading about this, because I was interested in why, you know, if amphetamine makes you sort of locomotion stimulating, euphoria and excitement, why would a drug that was related like Ritalin and Adalat, why would these amphetamine drugs be useful for those who have attention deficit disorder? You would have thought that something like that kind of stimulant would make things worse. In fact, actually, it can bring some improvements. But in one particular study that I found, the workers reported that animals taking an amphetamine, they ran around the cages a lot, less attentive, so they tended to be busier rather than brighter. So they did a lot of stuff around the cage, but it didn't make them any smarter. And so it was experiments like this that made me think, well, is there any value to using amphetamine-like drugs to increase cognitive ability? So here's a paper that I found quite interesting where they looked at psychostimulants as cognitive enhancers in adolescents, posing the question, is there more risk than there is reward? The two drugs that you may have heard of are Ritalin and Adderall, and you'll see here from the table that both Ritalin and Adderall, they block the norepinephrine transporter or noradrenaline transporter, the uptake 1 transporter, and that's the same method that amphetamines use to gain access to the nerves. Of course, therefore, it affects the noradrenergic and dopaminergic systems, you'll see here that Ritalin is classed as fairly moderate and not producing addiction, whereas Adderall is highly addictive. But what was interesting was that the paper highlights, as you see here in this quote, a dearth of knowledge on dosing, metabolism, and outcomes in juveniles. And they also go on to suggest that young brains may be hypersensitive to methylphenidate. And this is something that's worth thinking about, that those who use drugs of abuse quite possibly start at an earlier age. And the reasons why people would get into taking drugs are manifold, and we'll probably cover a little bit more about that in the addiction independence lecture. But young brains are constantly changing, and if you can cause such a dramatic effect on the balance of neurotransmitters in a young and developing brain, and you do it consistently with drugs that can moderate concentrations of dopamine and 5-HT and noradrenaline, then it's possibly not surprising that it could have lasting effects. What's concerning, I suppose, is that in the US, as you see here, as many as 20% of students are using these types of drugs, and these would be university age students of roughly your own age. So it's a huge problem on the US campus environment. I have tried on a number of occasions to get numbers for Glasgow University. I've been unsuccessful in getting the numbers, not because I particularly want to identify anybody, but I think it would be interesting to know in our student population, is the use of Ritalin and Adderall and these kind of stimulants a problem? I just